I remember the last time I knew my name, not the moment when the parasite hatched inside me, not the instant when the village chief held me down while Sadler's priest performed what they called a baptism, not even the first convulsions that racked my body as something alive began threading its way up my spinal cord. I remember something quieter, something that felt like ending and beginning at the same time. There was a morning, maybe 3 weeks after they opened the mines. The sun came up over the valley the way it always had, painting the eastern hills in shades of amber and gold that reminded me why my ancestors had chosen this place, why we'd farmed this land for generations, why we'd built our lives in the shadow of Salazar's castle, why we'd believed that isolation protected us rather than trapped us. I stood in my field, the same field my father had worked and his father before him, holding a handful of soil that had fed my family for longer than anyone could remember. The dirt was good, dark and rich, the kind of earth that makes tomatoes grow fat and red, that turns wheat stalks thick enough to bend under their own weight. I let it fall through my fingers, watching it catch the morning light as it tumbled back to where it came from. And I thought about how strange it was that dirt could feel like home, how the smell of it, loamy and ancient, could mean safety, could mean you belong to something larger than yourself. That was the last thought I had that was completely my own. The recognition of belonging, the understanding that this place, this land, these people were the sum total of everything that mattered, everything I was willing to protect, everything I would die for. I didn't know then that I'd already started dying weeks ago, that the spores we'd breathed in the darkness beneath the earth had taken root in ways no soil could, that what I thought was illness, the fever and the coughing blood, and the moments when the world would swim away into red-tinged blackness, was actually something growing, something ancient and patient and impossibly hungry, rewriting me from the inside out. My name was Diego Flores. I was 32 years old. I had a wife, Isabella, and a daughter named Carmen who'd just turned 9. We lived in a stone cottage at the edge of the village proper, close enough to hear the church bells, but far enough that we could pretend the rest of the world didn't exist. I grew vegetables and raised chickens, and every Sunday I'd take whatever surplus we had down to the village center to sell or trade. It wasn't wealth, but it was honest work. It was enough. That's what I tell myself now, in the moments when something like memory flickers through the parasite's control, when the plaga retreats just enough for me to remember what I was before I became what I am. It was enough. It should have been enough. But Sadler came to our village with promises. Salvation, he called it. Liberation from the burden of choice. The end of suffering through the embrace of divine purpose. He spoke in the church where we'd baptized Carmen, where Isabella and I had spoken our vows, where generations of our families had gathered to mark the passages of life and death and everything between. Father Cortez, who'd known me since I was Carmen's age, stood beside the stranger and nodded along as if Sadler's words made sense, as if the strange symbols he painted on the church walls, sigils that looked like something between a religious icon and a dissection diagram, were holy. The village chief, Bitores Mendez, he was the first. Big man, strong enough to carry a full-grown cow across his shoulders, respected enough that when he spoke, people listened. He stood before us all and told us that Sadler had shown him the truth, that Los Illuminados weren't the devil worshippers the old stories claimed, but enlightened ones who understood the path to paradise, that the plagas weren't parasites but gifts, sacred beings that would elevate us beyond the limitations of mere humanity. I should have run, should have grabbed Isabella and Carmen and fled into the mountains. Consequences be damned. But where would we have gone? This valley was all we knew. The outside world was a distant rumor, and the roads out were watched by men who'd been our neighbors, until Mendez's words convinced them they needed to guard against those who might reject enlightenment. So when they called for volunteers to excavate the old mines, to help unearth the treasures Sadler promised waited in the darkness beneath Salazar's fortress, I went. Not because I believed, but because refusing would have marked us as outsiders, would have made my family targets. In a village growing smaller and stranger by the day, being marked was death of a different kind. The mines were old, older than the castle, older than any structure in the valley. The entrance had been sealed with stones that bore markings in a language nobody could read, warnings in characters that predated even the first Salazar's crusade against Los Illuminados. We pried them away with crowbars and picks, following Sadler's directions to spaces that shouldn't have existed. Tunnels that dropped deep into the mountain's heart, chambers carved with precision that spoke of purpose rather than mineral extraction. It was cold down there, the kind of cold that has nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the absence of life. No insects, no rats, no signs that anything living had touched these spaces in centuries. Just stone and darkness and the sound of our own breathing echoing off walls that pressed in from all sides. We found them in the deepest chamber, not treasures, not gold or artifacts, or anything that could be sold or displayed. We found fossilized remains embedded in the rock face, things that looked like they might have been arthropods once, crustaceans perhaps, but wrong in ways that made your eyes hurt to look at too long. Segmented bodies with too many joints, appendages that seemed designed to grip and burrow, and something else, something we couldn't see but could feel, a presence in the air itself that made the hair on your arms stand up and your stomach clench with instinctive fear. Sadler was delighted. He ran his hands over the stone, whispering prayers in languages I didn't recognize, and told us we'd found the sacred ancestors, the sleeping gods who would wake and make us whole. I thought he was insane, thought the isolation and religious fervor had broken something in his mind. But Mendez stood beside him, nodding with an expression that looked almost like rapture, and I remembered that in our village, Mendez's word was law. We extracted the fossils, carefully, reverently, following Sadler's instructions to the letter. Some of them crumbled to dust at the first touch. Others came away intact, still somehow heavy, with potential despite centuries of dormancy. We carried them up from the darkness into the light of day, and Sadler had them taken to the church. To be studied, he said, to be awakened. That's when people started getting sick. It began with the miners, men I'd worked beside in the tunnels, friends who'd shared water and bread and complained about the same aching backs and calloused hands. They developed fevers, started coughing blood, would lose time, whole hours vanishing into fugue states where they'd stand motionless, eyes fixed on nothing, only coming back to themselves with no memory of the absence. The village doctor, an old man named Alonso who delivered half the children in the valley, couldn't explain it, sent samples to the medical authorities in Madrid, requested assistance, pleaded for someone to come investigate what he called an outbreak of unknown origin. No one came. The roads in and out of the valley were controlled by Sadler's people now, and letters had a way of never reaching their destinations. Alonso died 3 weeks into the outbreak. Found him in his clinic, collapsed over his desk, blood dried on his lips and scattered across the pages of notes he'd been writing. His last entry, scrawled in handwriting that deteriorated from measured and precise to barely legible, documented his own symptoms, the fevers, the blood, the dreams that felt more real than waking, the sensation of something moving inside his chest, something that shouldn't be there, something that was changing him in ways he couldn't articulate but could feel in every cell of his body. I got sick 2 days later. It started with the cough, dry at first, the kind you dismiss as dust from the fields or too much time in the barn, then wet, productive, bringing up fluid that wasn't quite blood, but wasn't quite spit either, dark red and thick, tasting of copper and something else, something organic and alive in a way that made you want to vomit. Isabella wanted to leave, begged me to pack what we could carry and flee while we still could, but Carmen was already showing symptoms. That little cough we'd attributed to a cold had turned into something worse. She couldn't keep food down. Her eyes, beautiful dark brown eyes she'd inherited from her mother, had started to redden, blood vessels bursting in the whites, giving her a perpetually bloodshot appearance that made her look decades older than 9 years should allow. We couldn't run, not with Carmen sick, not when every road out of the valley was watched, not when the alternative to staying was dying somewhere in the mountains with no one to bury us. Sadler came to our home on a Thursday. I remember because Thursdays were market day, when the village center would fill with sellers and buyers, when life felt almost normal despite everything falling apart around us. But the market hadn't happened in weeks. The village center was empty except for Mendez and his enforcers, men who'd been farmers and shopkeepers until the parasite made them something else, something that wore human faces but moved with inhuman purpose. He knocked politely, waited for me to answer like a neighbor paying a social call, stood on my threshold with that gentle smile he wore, the one that never quite reached his eyes, and told me he could save Carmen. The sickness, he explained, wasn't sickness at all. It was transformation. The sacred plagas, the sleeping gods we'd awakened in the mines were choosing hosts, claiming bodies worthy of divinity. Those who fought the process suffered. Those who died were simply not strong enough to receive the gift. But those who embraced it, who allowed the plaga to complete its work, they would be elevated, made stronger, better, freed from the weaknesses that plague ordinary humanity. Carmen was dying. That was obvious even through my fever-addled mind. The cough had gotten worse. She couldn't stand without help. Spent most of her time in bed, skin pale as winter snow, breathing in shallow gasps that rattled in her chest like broken glass. Isabella hadn't left her side in days, and the look in my wife's eyes, the desperate grief of a mother watching her child slip away, was more than I could bear. So I said yes, not for myself. I would have chosen death, would have preferred whatever natural end the parasite intended, rather than the transformation Sadler promised. But for Carmen, for the chance that she might survive, might grow up and have a life, even if that life was changed beyond recognition, I agreed to anything. The baptism happened at dawn. They called it baptism, made it sound holy, spiritual, a sacrament no different from the christening Carmen had received as an infant. But what happened in that church bore no resemblance to any religious ceremony I'd witnessed. The symbols Sadler had painted on the walls glowed with bioluminescence I couldn't explain, organic light that pulsed in rhythm with something that might have been heartbeat or might have been something else entirely. Mendes held me down, not violently, not with anger, but with the mechanical efficiency of someone performing a familiar task. I was too weak from the fever to fight, too consumed by the thing growing inside me to do more than struggle feebly as they laid me on the altar, stripped me to the waist, marked my chest with symbols in blood that I couldn't identify as human or animal or something else entirely. Sadler spoke in tongues, languages that predated Spanish, that might have predated human speech altogether, guttural syllables that resonated in your bones, that made the air itself feel thick and alive. And then he produced the injection, not a syringe like Alonso would have used. This was older, more primitive, a hollow tube of bone or chitin, carved with the same symbols that covered the church walls. Inside, visible through the translucent material, something moved, something alive and writhing, eager to find a host. The pain when he drove it into my chest was unlike anything I'd experienced, not the sharp sting of a cut or the dull ache of overworked muscles. This was deeper, more fundamental, the sensation of something foreign forcing its way into your body, burrowing through flesh and muscle and bone with single-minded purpose. I screamed, tried to thrash away, but Mendez held me with strength that no human should possess, and the thing in Sadler's injection slid home. For a moment nothing happened. I lay there gasping, wondering if this was how I died, if whatever Sadler had injected would simply stop my heart and end the nightmare. But then it moved. I felt it crawl through my chest cavity, seeking, questing, looking for something specific. It found my spine, attached itself with appendages I could sense but not see, thousands of microscopic hooks digging into nerve tissue, into the column of electrical signals that connected brain to body. And then it began to grow. The fever intensified, temperature spiking to levels that should have caused brain damage, that should have killed me outright. But the plaga kept me alive. I could feel it working, sense its presence like a second heartbeat, synchronized with my own. It fed on something, drew nutrition from my blood or my tissues or my very life force, and used that energy to expand, to change me. The convulsions came next, muscle spasms so severe they would have broken bones if the plaga hadn't been reinforcing my skeletal structure from the inside. My body twisted, contorted, bent in directions that defied anatomy, and through it all I remained conscious. The plaga wanted me awake, wanted me to experience every moment of transformation, to understand, on a visceral level, that I was being remade. Time lost meaning. Hours or days or weeks might have passed. I couldn't tell. The church had no windows, no way to track the sun's movement, only the endless cycle of pain and delirium, punctuated by moments when Sadler would return to check on my progress, to whisper encouragement in languages I was beginning to understand despite never having heard them before. The plaga was teaching me, not through words but through direct neural interface. It downloaded information into my brain, vast libraries of instinct and knowledge that weren't mine but became mine the moment they arrived. I learned the hierarchy, understood that there were different types of plaga, different strains and purposes. The one inside me was subordinate, designed to follow orders from those who carried the dominant strain. Sadler, Mendez, Salazar up in his castle. They were the masters, and we who carried the lesser parasites would obey. I learned about the history, the ancient cult that had discovered the plagas millennia ago in the Bronze Age, how they'd use them to create armies, to control populations, to build empires that rose and fell in the shadows of recorded history, how the Salazar family had crushed them, driven them underground, sealed the parasites away to prevent their return, and how Sadler, descendant of those original cultists, had convinced the Eighth Castellan to undo his ancestors' work, to release what should have remained imprisoned forever. I learned about the others, the entire village infected, some through baptism like mine, others through simple exposure, breathing spores released when we opened the mines. The children couldn't survive it, their bodies too small, too undeveloped to withstand the parasite's growth. They died first, quietly, their parents finding them cold in their beds one morning and having no choice but to bury them in the cemetery behind the church, Carmen among them, dead while I lay delirious, before the baptism could save her. That knowledge came through the Plaga's teaching, sharp and clear and devastating. My daughter was gone. The reason I'd agreed to this transformation, the justification I'd clung to through the pain, had been stripped away before the process even completed. I damned myself for nothing. The grief should have destroyed me, should have shattered whatever remained of my sanity. But the Plaga wouldn't allow it. It suppressed emotion, dampened the neural pathways responsible for processing loss and pain and despair, not eliminating them entirely, just reducing them to manageable levels, background noise rather than overwhelming cacophony. I knew Carmen was dead. I understood that my daughter was gone, but the screaming anguish I should have felt was muted, distant, like hearing someone else's tragedy through walls too thick to really penetrate. Isabella had survived her own baptism, had been transformed alongside me, her parasite maturing at roughly the same rate. We were reunited in the church after the worst of the convulsions passed, both of us pale and bloodied and fundamentally changed in ways that went deeper than the physical. She looked at me with eyes that had shifted from brown to red, blood vessels permanently burst and infected with bioluminescence that made them glow faintly in dim light, and I looked back with eyes that matched hers. We recognized each other, knew we were still the people we'd been, somewhere underneath the rewiring, but we also knew we were something else now, something that belonged to Sadler and his vision of enlightenment. We didn't speak about Carmen, couldn't bring ourselves to acknowledge what we'd lost or that we'd lost it for nothing. The Plaga made us forget to mourn, made us focus instead on the tasks assigned to us by those who carried the dominant strain. We had work to do. The village needed to continue functioning, needed to maintain the illusion of normalcy for any outsiders who might come investigating. And more than that, we had to prepare for the holy mission Sadler had been planning, the reason he'd awakened the Plagas in the first place. The return to daily life should have felt impossible. How do you go back to planting seeds and tending chickens when a parasitic arthropod has taken up residence in your nervous system? When every thought is monitored by something that isn't you? When your body responds to commands you didn't consciously give? But the Plaga made it possible. It wanted us to maintain our routines, to present as normal villagers going about normal business. So we did. I woke with the sun like I always had, dressed in the same clothes I'd worn before the transformation, walked out to the same fields I'd worked for 15 years. The soil felt different under my hands now, not because it had changed, but because my perception had been altered. I could sense things I'd never noticed before, the chemical composition of the earth, the network of microorganisms that made it fertile, the presence of other infected hosts nearby, their plagas broadcasting location and status through high-frequency signals I couldn't hear but could somehow sense, like radar but organic, biological, wrong. The vegetables grew the same way they always had, tomatoes ripening in neat rows, carrots pushing through the dark earth, lettuce unfurling in perfect green spirals. I tended them with the same care I'd always shown, hands moving through familiar motions that the Plaga didn't need to control. Muscle memory was still mine. The knowledge of how to farm, where to plant, when to harvest, all of that remained intact. The parasite only took control when it mattered, when orders came from above or threats appeared or the collective needed direction. Other times I was almost myself, almost Diego Flores, farmer, widower now, though we didn't speak of it, community member in a community that had been hollowed out and filled with something that wore human faces but served inhuman purposes. The village looked normal to outsiders. If anyone had come investigating, which they didn't because Sadler's people controlled all communications, They would have seen farmers working fields, and shepherds tending flocks, and shopkeepers selling goods in the market square. They might have noticed the eyes, red and glowing faintly in certain light, but attributed that to the region's poor water quality or some local condition. They might have sensed the wrongness in our movements, the way we sometimes stood too still or responded to stimuli that didn't exist, but dismissed it as cultural difference or rural peculiarity, because we were good at pretending. The plaga made us good at it, maintained just enough of our original personalities and behaviors to pass casual inspection. We laughed at appropriate times, spoke in normal cadences about normal things, complained about the weather and the harvest and the difficulties of life in an isolated valley. We were convincing because we were still human, mostly, in the ways that mattered for deception. But at night things changed. When the sun set and darkness covered the valley, we gathered, not by choice, though choice had become a complicated concept. The plaga compelled us, broadcast orders through its high frequency communication network that bypassed conscious thought and went straight to the motor cortex. We'd stop whatever we were doing, stop mid conversation or mid task, and walk to designated assembly points, the church, the village center, sometimes the mines where it had all started. Mendez would be there, massive and imposing in the torchlight, his plaga fully integrated and powerful enough that he could trigger partial transformations at will. His eyes glowed brighter than ours. His strength had increased to genuinely superhuman levels. He could lift equipment that should have required 3 men, could snap thick lumber like kindling, could grab a ganado by the throat and hold them aloft, one-handed, with no apparent effort. He spoke to us in Spanish, but the meaning came through the plaga network as much as through words. Instructions for the mission, preparations for when the American agent arrived, because Sadler had foreseen that someone would come looking for the girl they'd kidnapped, the president's daughter, Ashley Graham, held somewhere in the castle awaiting her own baptism. When her parasite matured, when she returned to her father carrying the gift of enlightenment in her blood, Los Illuminados would have access to the highest levels of American government, would be able to spread the plagas across the entire United States, creating an army of ganados that could reshape the world according to Sadler's vision. We were told to prepare for violence. The agent, this Leon Kennedy, would be trained and armed and dangerous. We need to stop him, kill him if possible, delay him if not, protect the mission at all costs, even if that cost was our own destruction. The plaga made that acceptable, dampened the survival instinct that should have made us question orders to throw ourselves at an armed government operative. We'd fight because we had no choice, because the parasite demanded it, because Sadler's will was absolute. The training began immediately. Combat instruction for people who'd never fought anything more dangerous than a stubborn goat. We learned to use our tools as weapons. Pitchforks became spears. Scythes transformed into deadly cutting implements. Axes designed for splitting wood could split skulls with equal efficiency. The plaga enhanced our coordination, improved our reaction times, suppressed the fear and hesitation that would normally make a farmer poor at violence. We practiced in the fields, ran drills where some of us played the intruder and others learned to swarm and overwhelm. The plaga coordinated our movements, allowed us to attack in patterns no group of untrained civilians should have been capable of executing. We learned to communicate through the high-frequency network, to share targeting information and tactical updates without speaking. Learned that injury didn't matter the way it used to, that we could function through pain that should have been debilitating, that we'd keep fighting until our bodies were literally incapable of movement. Some of us were selected for special roles. Stronger Ganados, men who'd been laborers or craftsmen before the transformation, were given the plagas that triggered more extreme mutations. I watched Esteban, the village blacksmith, receive an injection of enhanced parasites that made him swell to nearly 8 feet tall, watched the plaga burst from his back in flowering tentacles, watched his muscles bulk and distort until he looked more like a biological weapon than a human being. He was designated El Gigante, the giant, kept in the mines and released when overwhelming force was needed. Others received different modifications. The man we called Salvador, the town butcher who'd already been unsettling before the parasite, was given a dominant strain plaga that let him maintain perfect control while accessing enhanced strength and resistance to injury. They gave him a chainsaw, taught him to use it not for cutting wood, but for cutting through anything that stood in the mission's way. He became a terror weapon, something that would inspire panic in anyone who encountered him. I remained a standard ganado, useful for farming during the day, for combat when needed, but not special enough to merit enhancement. The plaga in my system was ordinary, subordinate, designed to take orders and execute them with minimum individual thought. I was a tool, sophisticated enough to maintain my facade of humanity, simple enough to be controlled absolutely when it mattered. The days blurred together, farming, eating, sleeping dreamless sleep that the plaga enforced, blocking the nightmares that should have come, gathering at night for coordination and instruction, learning the patterns we need to execute when Kennedy arrived. The village became a trap, every building and street and field positioned to funnel the intruder toward predetermined kill zones. We were living weapons arranged by a mind that thought in terms of tactics and sacrifice and acceptable losses. I should have hated it, should have fought against the control, raged against the loss of autonomy, done something to resist. But resistance required will, and will was the first thing the plaga took. Not obviously, not with force, but with subtle erosion. Every time you thought about defying an order, about acting against the mission, the parasite would trigger a cascade of neural inhibitors that made the thought feel impossible. Not forbidden, just unthinkable. Like trying to imagine a color that doesn't exist or willingly stop your own heart. The concept wouldn't form into action, so I farmed, tended the fields that had been in my family for generations, grew vegetables that nobody would eat because the village had stopped really eating, the plaga providing most of our nutritional needs through some mechanism I didn't understand and couldn't question. The tomatoes I harvested went to rot, the carrots stayed in the ground. The work was maintenance, theater, a performance for an audience that would never come. Isabella and I coexisted in the cottage we'd shared with Carmen, moved around each other like ghosts occupying the same space without really intersecting. We didn't speak about our daughter, didn't acknowledge the empty room where she'd slept, or the toys still scattered in the corner, or the drawings she'd made in her final days. Childish pictures of the village and the castle and the family she'd wanted to grow old with. The plaga wouldn't let us mourn, but it couldn't make us forget. So we carried the knowledge of her death like stones in our chest, heavy and cold and permanent. Sometimes in the moments between waking and full consciousness, I'd remember what it felt like to be human, the sensation of choice, of deciding what you'd do with your day, who you'd speak to, what you'd eat for dinner, simple things that added up to autonomy, and then the plaga would fully activate, flooding my system with the compounds that made obedience feel natural, and I'd forget why those memories mattered. The other ganados were the same. We recognized each other's suffering in sideways glances and moments of hesitation that the parasite couldn't quite suppress. The village baker, who used to make sweet bread that smelled like heaven, stood at his empty ovens with flour-dusted hands and something like grief in his red eyes. The seamstress, whose shop had once been filled with the chatter of women getting measurements taken and fabrics selected, sat at her silent sewing machine and stared at nothing. We were all dying in slow motion, personalities eroding under the plaga's influence, becoming less ourselves and more extensions of Sadler's will with every passing day. But we maintained the routines, the appearance of normalcy, because somewhere in the part of us that remembered being human, we understood that if we stopped pretending, if we gave up the facade entirely, then we'd lose whatever remained of our identity. We'd become pure Ganado, empty shells that wore human faces but contained nothing recognizably human underneath. The village changed subtly. Buildings fell into disrepair that no one bothered to fix. Paint peeled from walls, fences rotted where they stood. The church, which had been the center of our community, became something else, a temple to Sadler's vision, decorated with symbols that hurt to look at directly, filled with the smell of decay and incense and something organic that didn't have a name. Father Cortez led services that weren't Christian, weren't any religion I recognized, where we chanted in the old languages the Plaga taught us and offered devotion to parasites we were told were divine. The livestock persisted. Chickens still scratched in the dirt. Cows still needed milking. Dogs still barked at shadows. Animals were immune to the plaga, or at least resistant enough that they remained unchanged. They seemed to sense what we'd become, though. The chickens wouldn't approach us anymore. The cows would shy away from our touch. The dogs, animals that had been friendly and affectionate before the transformation, would growl and show teeth when we came near. They knew we were wrong, recognized on some instinctive level that the humans who'd once cared for them had been replaced by something that looked similar but wasn't. We were predators now, even if we pretended otherwise, creatures that would kill without hesitation when ordered. The animals understood that better than we did. Weeks passed, or months. Time was difficult to track when every day followed the same pattern. Farm during daylight, gather and train after dark, sleep when the plaga allowed it, exist in the narrow space between human and monster that Sadler's parasites had carved out for us. Then the preparations intensified. Mendez announced that Kennedy was approaching, had crossed into Spain, was making his way toward our valley, would arrive within days. The village shifted from routine to readiness. We stockpiled weapons, simple tools that could kill. We set traps in the outlying areas, bear traps disguised beneath leaves and tripwires connected to explosives. We established patrol routes and communication protocols and fallback positions for when the fighting started, because it would start. Kennedy would come, and we would attack, and people would die. That was certain. The only question was how many and how quickly, and whether any of us would retain enough humanity to regret it. I was assigned to the village center response team. When Kennedy entered the main square, when he walked into the trap we'd been preparing for weeks, I'd be among the ganados who swarmed him. First wave meant to test his responses and capabilities. Expendable, though the briefing didn't use that word. We were told we'd likely take casualties, that some of us wouldn't survive the initial engagement, but that was acceptable because our deaths would provide tactical information, would let the second and third waves attack more effectively. The plaga made me accept that assessment, made the prospect of dying to provide data for Sadler's mission feel reasonable, natural, the way things should be. I wondered, in the small part of my mind that remained capable of wonder, whether this was how soldiers felt, whether the training and discipline that made men charge into gunfire created the same kind of acceptance. whether all violence required this kind of neural rewiring, this suppression of self-preservation in favor of collective purpose, or whether what we had was different, worse, the product of parasitic override rather than human choice. Not that it mattered. Wondering didn't change anything. The mission would proceed. Kennedy would arrive, and I would attack him with every ounce of strength the Plaga granted me, using farming tools as weapons against a man who'd done nothing to me personally, because the thing in my spine demanded it. The night before Kennedy's projected arrival, I stood in my field one last time. The tomatoes had rotted on the vine. The soil I'd once loved smelled sour, contaminated by some chemical runoff from the mines. The sky was clear, stars visible in configurations I'd known since childhood, but they looked different now, more distant, as if the transformation had put me on a different planet, somewhere that just happened to share the same geography as my home. I thought about Diego Flores, the man I'd been before the mines opened, before Sadler came, before the parasite took root. He'd been simple, limited in scope and ambition, but content within those limitations. He'd loved his wife and daughter, had taken pride in the quality of his crops, had believed the work he did mattered, even if it only mattered to the few dozen people who shared his valley. That man was gone, murdered by his own acceptance, by the decision to agree to baptism, by the naive hope that submitting to transformation might save his child. The thing wearing his body, walking his fields, living in his home, was something else, a ganado, a tool in human shape. The worst part was that I could still remember being him. The plaga left enough of my memories and personality intact to ensure I knew what I'd lost. That was the cruelty at the heart of Sadler's design. We weren't turned into mindless zombies. We retained enough consciousness to suffer, to understand that we were trapped in bodies we couldn't control, serving purposes we didn't choose, moving toward a future that held nothing but violence and death, but we couldn't refuse, couldn't rebel, couldn't even properly mourn what we'd become. The plaga had taken those options away, left us with consciousness but no agency, awareness but no power. We were ghosts piloting corpses, present but not in control, watching our hands commit atrocities we couldn't prevent. Dawn came with the sound of church bells, the signal that Kennedy had entered the valley, that the mission was beginning, that everything we'd been preparing for was now real and immediate and inevitable. I walked toward the village center with the others, moved in synchronized patterns dictated by the Plaga network, positioned myself in a building overlooking the square where Kennedy would be funneled. I carried a pitchfork, tines sharpened to deadly points, grip worn smooth by years of legitimate agricultural work. It felt wrong in my hands, not because of the weight or the balance, but because I knew what I'd be using it for. The American arrived sooner than expected, driving a police car that pulled into the square like he belonged there, like our village was just another stop on a routine investigation. He got out slowly, cautiously, one hand on his weapon even though nothing seemed immediately threatening. Young, maybe late 20s, with the careful movements of someone trained for violence but hoping to avoid it. He approached the first ganado he saw, old Miguel, who'd been the village drunk before the transformation and was somehow even more unsettling after it. Asked about a missing girl, about Americans who might have come through recently. Miguel responded in Spanish, words that sounded normal enough but were carefully scripted by Sadler's network, drawing Kennedy closer, making him lower his guard, setting up the attack that would come in seconds. And then Miguel turned, fast, faster than any drunk should have moved, and grabbed Kennedy with strength that made the American's eyes go wide. The signal had been given. The trap was sprung. I vaulted through the window with the others, felt the plaga take full control, suppress any remaining hesitation, flood my system with compounds that heightened aggression and dulled pain reception. My body moved with precision I'd never possessed before the parasite, coordinating perfectly with the dozen other Ganados converging on Kennedy's position. He fought well, better than the briefings had suggested. Threw Miguel off with a combat technique that spoke of serious training. Drew his weapon and put 2 rounds in the nearest Ganado's chest. Center mass shots that should have been kill shots but only made the infected farmer stumble. We didn't go down easy. The plaga kept us moving through injuries that should have been incapacitating. I thrust with the pitchfork, aimed for Kennedy's back while he was distracted by attackers from the front, but he sensed me somehow, rolled left, and my tines buried in the wall where his kidney should have been. He kicked my legs out, sending me sprawling, and I felt the impact of his boot against my ribs with distant surprise. Pain existed, but mattered less than it should have. The plaga simply noted the damage and adjusted my movement patterns to compensate. The fight moved through the village center, Kennedy retreating toward buildings, trying to limit angles of attack, us pursuing relentlessly, accepting casualties that would have broken any normal group's morale. I watched Rosa, the baker's wife, take a headshot that should have killed her instantly, but the plaga wasn't in her brain. It was in her spine, her chest, controlling her body even after consciousness ceased. She kept moving for several seconds, arms outstretching toward Kennedy in a parody of human motion before finally collapsing. Something erupted from her neck. The plaga itself, exposed now that brain function had ended. It burst through the flesh in a flowering of tentacles, blade-like appendages whipping toward Kennedy with speed that made them blur. He stumbled back, fired 3 rounds into the parasite's central mass, and it shrieked, a sound that wasn't human and wasn't animal but something between. The sound of an organism that had no business existing suddenly confronted with its own mortality. It died. Rosa's body fell completely still, and the plaga network registered the loss, adjusted tactics, compensated for the reduced numbers. We kept attacking, drove Kennedy into a 2-story house at the edge of the square, the old Hernandez place that had stood empty since the family died in the early days of the outbreak. He barricaded himself inside, pushed furniture against the doors and windows, gave himself breathing room to reassess the situation. The plaga sent us after him, no hesitation, no consideration of the tactical stupidity of funneling into a fortified position. We were meant to overwhelm through numbers, to sacrifice ourselves in waves until Kennedy's ammunition ran out or his position became untenable. We were expendable resources, not soldiers who needed to be preserved. I climbed through a window with 4 others, dropped into a room where Kennedy had positioned himself in the corner, maximizing his field of fire. He shot the first Ganado through the head. The second took rounds to the chest and kept coming until a lucky shot severed the spine. The third made it close enough to grab him before a knife materialized in Kennedy's hand and opened the Ganado's throat in one smooth motion. I was fourth, rushed him while he was dealing with number 3, pitchfork thrust toward his unprotected side. He twisted at the last second, let the tines pass under his arm, and drove an elbow into my face hard enough that I felt bone crack. My nose shattered. Blood sprayed across his jacket, but the plaga kept me upright, kept me functioning, drove me forward for a second attack even as my vision swam. Kennedy shot me, center mass, same as he'd shot the others. 2 rounds that punched through my chest and exited my back, taking pieces of lung with them. I should have died, should have dropped immediately, body shutting down from catastrophic damage to vital organs. But the plaga rerouted functions, sealed blood vessels, kept oxygenating what remained of my respiratory system through mechanisms I couldn't comprehend. I kept fighting, swung the pitchfork in wild arcs, forcing Kennedy to backpedal, creating opportunities for the other Ganados pouring through windows and doors. We were winning through attrition. He couldn't kill us fast enough, couldn't do enough. Damage to stop bodies, the Plaga kept animated past the point of death. Then the chainsaw started. Salvador had arrived, burst through the front door with the massive saw screaming, its blade moving so fast it looked like a solid disc of death. Kennedy's face went pale. This wasn't another farmer with a pitchfork. This was something else entirely, something that promised dismemberment rather than wounding, death rather than injury. The dynamic changed. Kennedy stopped trying to kill us and started trying to escape, ran for the stairs while we pursued, Salvador cutting through furniture and walls with equal ease. The house shook with each impact. Wood splintered. The Plaga network hummed with excitement, sensing victory, pushing us to close the distance and finish the American before he could regroup. But Kennedy was creative. He reached the second floor, grabbed a hand grenade from somewhere in his equipment, and threw it down the stairs at Salvador. The explosion wasn't large, not enough to kill, but it staggered the chainsaw-wielding Ganado long enough for Kennedy to reach a window and jump. He landed badly. I could see that from where I stood inside the house, watching through the window he'd escaped. His ankle twisted on impact, injury that would limit his mobility. The Plaga network immediately updated, shared the information, directed resources to exploit this weakness. We poured out of the house after him, dozens of Ganados converging from all directions, ready to swarm and overwhelm while he was vulnerable. And then the church bell rang, not the normal toll that marked hours or called to services. This was different, deeper, resonating with frequencies that touched the Plaga itself. Sadler's signal, the command to retreat, to break off the attack, to return to our assigned positions and await further instruction. Every Ganado stopped mid-motion, turned away from Kennedy as if he'd ceased to exist, walked toward the church with synchronized precision that must have looked supernatural from the outside. We left the American alive, bleeding and injured, but breathing, because the dominant strain had ordered it. I didn't understand why. The mission was to stop him, to protect the operation, to prevent outside interference with Sadler's plans. We'd had him, wounded, surrounded, running low on ammunition. Another few minutes and he'd have been dead, but Sadler had other ideas, purposes that subordinate Plagas like mine weren't privileged to understand. We obeyed because obedience was all we had. The dead remained where they'd fallen, Rosa with the Plaga still hanging from her shattered neck. Miguel crumpled against the police car. 3 others scattered across the square, bodies cooling, parasites dying inside their expired hosts. They'd served their purpose, provided data, revealed Kennedy's capabilities and tactics. Their deaths had value even if their lives no longer did. I walked past them without stopping. The Plaga wouldn't let me mourn, wouldn't let me acknowledge that these had been my neighbors, people I'd known for years, individuals with histories and families and reasons to have lived beyond becoming tactical sacrifices. They were just casualties now, acceptable losses in a campaign that would continue regardless of who fell. Back at my cottage, I examined the damage Kennedy had inflicted. The chest wounds had stopped bleeding, the Plaga sealing them with some kind of rapid clotting mechanism. My shattered nose had already begun to reset, bone fragments knitting together faster than should have been possible. Within hours, I'd be functional again, ready to fight, ready to die, ready to repeat the cycle as many times as the mission required. Isabella was there. She'd been part of a different response team, positioned to cut off escape routes if Kennedy fled the village center. She looked at me with her red eyes, saw the blood and the injuries and the evidence of violence, and something flickered across her face that might have been concern. The plaga dampened it immediately, but for just a moment I saw my wife, not the Ganado she'd become, but Isabella Flores, the woman I'd married in the church before it became a temple to parasitic gods. We didn't speak, didn't need to. The Plaga network had already shared tactical information, uploaded Kennedy's capabilities and fighting style to every subordinate strain in the valley. We knew what he could do now, knew we'd need different tactics, different approaches, more numbers, better coordination, specialized units like Salvador deployed more strategically. The mission would continue. Kennedy would be allowed to progress deeper into the valley, encountering escalating resistance as he went. We'd bleed him slowly, wear him down, drive him toward the castle where Sadler waited with the fully evolved plan. The village had been the first test. We'd failed to kill him, but succeeded in gathering intelligence. That would have to be enough. I returned to the fields the next day, worked the soil with the same mechanical precision I'd developed over weeks of pretending normalcy. The tomatoes continued to rot. The carrots stayed buried. The work was theater, but theater I'd perform until the plaga decided otherwise. Other ganados went about their routines too. The baker stood at cold ovens. The seamstress sat at her silent machine. We maintained the facade because letting it drop meant admitting we'd lost everything that made us human. Better to pretend. Better to work fields that would never be harvested and bake bread no one would eat than to acknowledge we'd become weapons that sometimes remembered having been people. Kennedy moved through the valley systematically. We could track his progress through the Plaga network, feel each encounter as subordinate strains were destroyed. He reached the farm, fought through more ganados there, including some of the specialized units, Salvador among them, who'd fallen back after the village center engagement. He survived again, killed efficiently and without mercy, cutting through infected villagers like they were just obstacles rather than human beings, trapped in bodies they couldn't control. Maybe that's all we were to him, obstacles, enemies to be neutralized. He couldn't know that each ganado he killed had been someone once, had owned farms or businesses or homes, had loved families and mourned losses and lived full, complicated lives before the plaga reduced them to hostile bodies in his path. Or maybe he did know, and it didn't matter. Maybe that knowledge wouldn't have changed anything. Maybe survival required that kind of ruthlessness. The days blurred together again, waiting for orders that came through the network, fighting when Kennedy's path brought him near, farming when there was nothing else to do. The cottage felt empty without Carmen's laughter, without the sounds of normal family life. Isabel and I existed in parallel, sharing space but not connection, two people hollowed out by the same parasite and left with nothing but routines to fill the void. The other ganados thinned out as Kennedy progressed. Each engagement cost us bodies. Not all dead, some simply too damaged to remain functional, but removed from active duty either way. The village center grew quieter. Fewer figures moved through the streets at night. The market square that had once hosted the whole community now echoed empty, except for patrols. We were being winnowed, reduced to the most durable, most useful subordinate strains, while the weak and damaged fell away. Natural selection accelerated by violence, Darwin's theories playing out over days instead of generations. I wondered if I'd be among the survivors, if my body was resilient enough, my plaga integrated enough to withstand the attrition Kennedy represented, or if I'd end up like Rosa, like Miguel, like the dozens of others whose names I couldn't quite remember anymore, dead in service to a mission I didn't understand, executed by a man who'd never know what he'd destroyed. The plaga didn't care about my wondering. It had its own priorities, its own sense of value and purpose that superseded any individual strain's survival. If I died serving the mission, that was acceptable. If I lived, that was acceptable too. The only thing that mattered was Sadler's plan proceeding uninterrupted. Kennedy reached the castle eventually, moved beyond the village entirely, taking his violence to Salazar's domain where the zealot Ganados waited. Different strain, different capabilities, but the same fundamental parasitic control. They'd fare no better than we had, would throw themselves at him with the same suicidal persistence, would die in the same numbers, would accomplish the same purpose of gathering data and bleeding resources. The village settled into a new rhythm. Fewer ganados meant fewer routines to maintain. The facades grew thinner, less convincing because there weren't enough of us left to properly simulate normal life. We moved through spaces that had held families and communities and found them empty, found ourselves rattling around in structures designed for populations that no longer existed. I stopped farming. There was no point anymore. The fields could lie fallow. The vegetables could rot where they grew. The chickens could starve in their coops. The pretense had been for Kennedy's benefit, to maintain the illusion of normalcy until he walked into the trap, but he'd moved on. The village was behind him now, relevant only as a combat zone he'd already passed through. So I stood in my cottage and stared at Carmen's drawings on the wall. The plaga wouldn't let me take them down, wouldn't let me destroy this evidence of what I'd lost, but it also wouldn't let me properly mourn. I existed in a liminal space between grief and numbness, feeling enough to know I should hurt, but incapable of hurting completely. Isabella had stopped maintaining her routines too. Sat in Carmen's room sometimes in the chair where she used to read bedtime stories, and stared at the empty bed. The plaga kept her functional, kept her capable of following orders when they came, but in the absence of immediate commands, she defaulted to this. Vigil over absence, witness to loss she couldn't properly process. We were dying slowly, not physically. The plaga kept our bodies functioning efficiently, but mentally, spiritually, in all the ways that mattered beyond simple biological persistence. The parasites had taken everything that made us human and left just enough consciousness to know what we'd lost. That was the real horror, not the physical transformation or the loss of control, but the awareness that we'd been reduced to this. Tools with just enough sentience to suffer. The Plaga network went quiet after Kennedy entered the castle. Whatever was happening there, it didn't require input from subordinate strains in the village. We were benched, sidelined, irrelevant to the final stages of Sadler's plan. Our purpose had been to slow Kennedy down, to test him, to serve as obstacles. We'd done that. Now we waited to learn if it had been enough. Days passed in silence. The church bells didn't ring. Mendez didn't summon us for coordination sessions. The village existed in suspended animation, Ganado standing in their assigned positions, or wandering through empty streets with no purpose beyond occupying space. I thought about Diego Flores again, tried to remember what it felt like to make a choice, to decide something for yourself rather than having the Plaga route all decisions through its hierarchical network. The memories were there but distant, like watching someone else's life through a dirty window. I'd been that man once, had lived in this cottage with my wife and daughter, had worked these fields by choice rather than compulsion, had believed the future held possibilities beyond violence and parasitic control. That man was dead, had been dead since the baptism, maybe since the moment I agreed to it, maybe since the mines opened and spores we couldn't see rewrote our biology while we slept. The thing wearing his body was just a remnant, a ghost animated by arthropod neurology and Sadler's will, but Ghost could remember. The Plaga couldn't take that away completely. So I stood in my field under the same sky Diego Flores had known, touching the same soil he'd loved, and I remembered what it felt like to be human, to have agency and choice, and the terrible, beautiful burden of deciding your own path. The memory was all I had left. The Plaga could control my body, could suppress my emotions, could route my actions through channels that served the mission, but it couldn't entirely erase the knowledge that I'd once been more than this, that somewhere in the meat and neural tissue and parasitic matter that comprised my current existence, something that remembered being Diego Flores persisted. It wasn't much, it didn't change anything. The mission would continue, Kennedy would either die or succeed, and my role in either outcome was already written. But knowing I'd been human once, that I'd loved and been loved, that I'd made choices even if the final choice had destroyed everything, that knowledge felt important somehow. The sun set on another empty day. The stars came out in patterns that had looked down on my ancestors and would look down on whatever came after us. The valley slept, or pretended to sleep, while the Plaga network hummed with low-level traffic that might have been thoughts or might have been simple data exchange. I stood in my field. The soil was dark beneath my feet. The stars were bright overhead, and somewhere in the center of my chest, where the Plaga had attached itself to my spine and taken control of everything I'd been, something that remembered being Diego Flores looked at the sky and wondered if ghosts could pray. The answer didn't matter. The question was enough, proof that some fragment of humanity persisted despite everything designed to eliminate it. I was a Ganado, a tool in human shape, a weapon deployed in service to purposes I didn't choose and couldn't refuse, but I was also, in some small, defiant way, still Diego Flores, farmer, widower, father to a daughter whose death I couldn't properly mourn, but also couldn't forget. And as long as that awareness persisted, as long as I could stand in my field and remember what it felt like to choose, then the Plaga hadn't entirely won. It was a hollow victory, changed nothing about my situation or my future, but it was mine. The parasite could take my body, my will, my ability to act in accordance with my own values, but it couldn't entirely erase the knowledge of what had been taken. I stood there until the Plaga decided I should move, until orders came through the network directing me elsewhere, and when I walked away from the field, from the cottage, from the life I'd once lived, I carried that small defiance with me. The mission would proceed. I would fight when told to fight, would die when death served Sadler's purpose. But until that moment came, I would remember, would hold on to the ghost of Diego Flores and the man he'd been before the parasite made him into something else. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't even resistance, not really. But it was human in a way the Plaga could never be. And in the end, that flicker of humanity, that desperate refusal to be completely erased, might be the only victory available to any of us. The night stretched on. The village waited, and somewhere in the castle events unfolded that would determine whether Sadler's plan succeeded or failed, whether the Plagas spread beyond this valley to infect the wider world or died here in the remote Spanish mountains where they'd slept for centuries. I didn't know which outcome I hoped for. The Plaga made hope difficult, made caring about consequences nearly impossible. But in the small space where Diego Flores still persisted, I thought maybe I wanted them to fail, wanted Kennedy to succeed, to kill Sadler, to destroy the parasites, and end the mission that had consumed so many lives. Not because it would save me, I was too far gone for salvation, but because it might prevent this from spreading, might keep other villages, other people, other families from experiencing what we'd been through, might ensure that Carmen's death and Isabella's transformation and my own reduction to parasitic tool meant something beyond just casualties in Sadler's campaign. The thought felt like rebellion, like the kind of thing the Plaga should have suppressed immediately, but it didn't. Either the parasite wasn't monitoring closely enough, or some part of it recognized that thoughts without actions were harmless. I could hope whatever I wanted as long as I obeyed when it mattered. So I hoped, quietly, without any expectation it would change anything. Hoped that Leon Kennedy was strong enough, smart enough, determined enough to do what we couldn't, to stop the mission, to end the nightmare. It was all a Ganado farmer could do. Remember what he'd been, recognize what he'd become, and hope that someone, somewhere, would be able to prevent others from following the same path. The stars wheeled overhead, the night aged toward dawn, and in the empty cottage where the Flores family had once lived, a thing that remembered being Diego stood at the window and watched the darkness, waiting for orders that would tell it how to move, how to fight, how to die. But underneath the parasitic control, underneath the neural hijacking and the chemical suppression, something human remained. Something that knew its name, that mourned its daughter, that recognized its wife in the red-eyed stranger who shared its space. Something that refused, in the only way available to it, to be completely erased. It wasn't much, but it was everything.